Hello and welcome. My name is Gonda van Steen and I'm the Koraes Chair of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature at King's College London. We continue our events under lockdown, and today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you three young researchers who bring their expertise of the BBC Greek Service archive and audio recordings to our events series focused on the Bush House. The Bush House, which at some point in history housed the BBC Greek Service, to be precise, between 1939 and 2005. So let me introduce you to these dynamic young researchers who have made this topic their object of study, their current study and future study. Fiona Antonelaki is holding a Princeton Research Fellowship, a Seeger Postdoctoral Fellowship, to explore precisely that modernist literary cultural dimension of the BBC Greek Service that has come to interest us a lot. They are actually, the two of them, Foteini and Fiona, are actually hosted by the Princeton Athens Center, to which we give our profound thanks. Fiona will turn this research in a book-length study on the subject of modernist literary cultures and the BBC Greek Service. Next to her is Foteini Dimirouli, who's an expert on Anglo-Greek cultural and literary relations, and she approaches the productions of the BBC Greek Service from that perspective. And with us also is Anna-Maria Sichani, who devotes attention to the literary productions of the Greek Service. She has done so in her PhD work, and she's continuing her research as a research fellow on an Arts and Humanities Research Council-funded project called Connected Histories of the BBC. She does so through the University of Sussex. So welcome, and I'll let these expert ladies take it on from here. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Gonda, for inviting us to talk about the Greek history of Bush House. And we thought today that maybe we can talk about six different but all interconnected topics related to the history of the BBC Greek section. So while I was trying to reconstruct the formative phase of the Greek section, I came across this clipping from the London Calling, one of the BBC's official publications. It's the one on the left. It is dated October 1940. That is 1 year after the launch of the Greek section, which was directly linked to the outbreak of the Second World War. The news bulletins in Greek are not listed as part of the European service, but as you can see, as part of the Near and Middle Eastern service, alongside transmissions in Turkish and Arabic. As the director of the Near Eastern Service explained in the BBC Handbook of 1941, and I quote from that, "For a time, broadcasts in Greek were largely for reasons of administrative convenience and geographic proximity added to the Near Eastern services. However, very soon, by the end of 1941, the Greek service had taken its rightful place in the European department, as the same source puts it. 1941 was also the year when the Greek section, together with the other foreign language services, moved from Broadcasting House, the headquarters of BBC, to Bush House at the Strand. As we learned from George Angeloglu, who was the head of the Greek section from its establishment until the late 1950s, the office of the Greek service was actually located right next to the Turkish service. And that was perhaps due to what has been described as administrative convenience and geographical proximity. Moreover, by 1941, broadcasts in Greek were produced in two different buildings. On the one hand, the daily bulletins were produced at the studios of Bush House as part of the European output. On the other hand, though, the bulletins addressed to listeners in Cyprus were transmitted from Broadcasting House as part of the output of the Empire service. Here on the right, you can see the foreign language services of the BBC, which are represented as figures in their national dresses. We are informed that the total airtime assigned to the Greek service, it is in the upper part, in 1942 was 1 hour per day, while to the Cypriot program it was 30 minutes per week. Note also that the figures representing the transmissions to Greece and to Cyprus are portrayed here in different national dresses. Michalis Kakogiannis, the main producer of the Cypriot program throughout the 1940s, later recalled working at Broadcasting House next to well-known writers who contributed to the Empire service, such as George Orwell, Louis MacNeice, and Rex Warner. And now I'm handing over the microphone to Foteini, as she will discuss the potential involvement of another celebrated British writer at the BBC Greek section.
This image depicts the British author Lawrence Durrell. He's mostly known for his magnum opus, the Alexandria Quartet, but also for his travel writing, based on his experiences in Greece and Cyprus, from the mid-30s to the late 50s. Durrell was an expatriate author with a long career working for British institutions, first as a press attaché to Egypt and the island of Rhodes, and then as a British Council Director in Argentina and Yugoslavia. In between these roles, when the end of the Second World War had enabled Durrell to relocate to Greece from Egypt, he applied for the position of Deputy Editor for the BBC Greek service. He was duly rejected. George Angeloglou, the head of the BBC Greek service, describes how, despite his own support, the rest of the committee deemed Durrell unsuited for the post. He was seen as, quote, too much of an individual, self-indulgent and conscious of his talent, unquote. The committee was also skeptical regarding Durrell's willingness to undertake the mundane chores attached to the job. He was known to be, quote, a heavy drinker and a womanizer, bound, after a while, to start going out a lot, meet interesting people, and spend less time in Bush House, unquote. This incident is telling of a conflict that was to accompany Durrell throughout his career, between his ambitions as a private individual and itinerant author and his employment in key positions within British institutions abroad. In 1954, following an application to the Queen, Durrell was appointed Director of Information Services for the colonial government in Cyprus. This is when the conflict I described earlier reached its apex. Now Durrell had to tally his self-proclaimed Philhellenism with a key position in colonial administration, at a time when the Cypriot anti-colonial struggle was intensifying and violence on the island escalating. As Director of Information, Durrell became responsible for the Cyprus Broadcasting Service, an instrument of British propaganda that sought to combat the Cypriot demand for enosis with Greece. Ironically, Durrell's duties included guiding BBC news managers to play down the reporting of pro-enosis disorders and demonstrations in Greece, and play up statements highlighting British achievements in Cyprus. When Durrell had been desperately searching for employment, he was rejected by the BBC Greek service on the grounds of his reputation as a bon vivant and a bohemian. 10 years later, he became deeply implicated in radio broadcasting politics, propaganda and censorship, all of this pertaining to the Cypriot struggle. Given Durrell's controversial career, it is only natural to wonder what would have happened had Durrell's application to the BBC been successful. Angeloglou mentions that it would perhaps have hindered his writing career, but then, he speculates, we might have inherited a 4-book saga about the BBC rather than Alexandria. And now passing on to Anna-Maria.
Thank you. Seferis discussed a statement against the dictatorship on the 29th of March 1969 has survived in our collective memory, paired with a bizarre archival finding. It's a photograph showing a rather younger Seferis in front of the BBC microphone. However, this photo has nothing to do with the statement in question, as it was taken 18 years before, in 1951, during an earlier visit of Seferis to the BBC studios, and more precisely during a BBC recording about the death of Angelos Sigirianos in July 1951. As regards Seferis' anti-Huta statement now, it has been recorded at his house on Agra Street, then sent to London at the Greek service of the BBC, from where it was initially broadcasted in the morning of the 29th March 1969. The statement was then rebroadcasted in the by radio stations in Paris and Germany, the German-based station Deutsche Welle, and forwarded by Robert Kelly to the State Department via telegram. In the morning of the same day, typed copies of the declaration were widely distributed to all morning newspapers, press offices, and foreign correspondents in Athens. However, the actual text of the statement has never been published in Greek newspapers, while its typed version was released at a much later time, around 1980. Since then, the statement itself has been extensively reproduced and commented on exclusively on the basis of its BBC radio broadcasting. Seferis, aiming to avoid Huta's preventive censorship, chose for the communication of his statement a different and at the same time a very familiar medium to him, that of radio broadcasting. And interestingly, the power of the medium has been so strong and also so enduring that the actual statement has since then been associated with this image of Seferis in front of a BBC microphone, despite this historical inaccuracy. Of course, Seferis' familiarity with radio and broadcasting does not come as a surprise. In tracing this unique relationship, we should go back to the early 1950s. And Seferis, then a consultant at the Greek Embassy in London, managed to establish a close collaboration with the BBC Greek service. Initially on the basis of radio presentation with a series of short radio talks, σύντομες ραδιοφωνικές ομιλίες, he named them, that he wrote exclusively for radio. His work was also presented for the first time on the BBC and to the British audience by Nanos Valaoritis, who was working there since 1949. Seferis, initially reluctant about broadcasting his poetry, enjoyed very, very much the experience. And through the years, the collaboration extended to radio readings of his poems, shared between him in Greek and well-known British poets, such as Cecil Day-Lewis in English. Not surprisingly, the systematic presence of Seferis' poetry on the British airwaves throughout the 1950s and 60s is related to the mass recognition of his work by the English-speaking and international audiences, coupled with translations and culminating in 1963 with a Nobel Prize. So the actual BBC radio broadcasting should be credited for the massive and immediate dissemination of Seferis' statement nationally and globally. The statement circulated abroad and its influence reached beyond Europe, mobilizing intellectuals, stakeholders and the public against the Greek dictatorship. It's not, after all, difficult to assume how comparatively smaller the impact of the statement would have been, but also how different Seferis' profile as a public intellectual would have been also if the statement had been published in the press, for example. In a symbolic way, the BBC microphone in this picture that wrongfully paired his statement has been a vehicle for his international reputation and for the crucial impact also of the statement as such, also in the years to follow. On the other hand, Seferis' statement has since then marked the Greek services of the BBC and its history as the venue for democratic voices and freedom of speech, a legacy that followed the service throughout the years. And I'm now handing over again the microphone to Fiona to present and to discuss all the different languages of the BBC Greek service.
Thank you, Anna-Maria. So the next item I would like to discuss is an unpublished letter I found among the private papers of Yolanda Terentzio, a prolific Greek journalist who moved to London and worked for the BBC from 1961 until the mid-1980s. It was written in October 1963, at the beginning of her career at the BBC. And although its recipient is unnamed, we can assume that it is addressed to one of Terencia's supervisors at the BBC. I shall read extracts from Terencia's long letter. Since my arrival at the BBC, I made the remark that I was astonished to realize that a free group of young people working for an independent organization like the BBC, with all its reputation for liveliness, should use, and with that strictness, the stale, dead idiom of the most retrograde forces in Greece. And Terentia then touches upon what she sees as the reason for this situation. We decided to use the formal written idiom so that we are not considered communists, Mr. Sidiropoulos dixit. Frossos Sidiropoulos is the earliest secretary of the Greek section. It seems that after the Civil War, she had been to Greece and met some gentleman of the state radio in Athens who casually said to her, "You at the BBC are for the left." Thus the BBC had to prove that it was not communist by branding itself with the best proof, the language of the bigots. A few lines below, Terentia clarifies that formal written idiom was decided to become the official language of the Greek service of the BBC, but just for news bulletin and the press review, the other items being advisable for obvious reasons to be written in the vernacular. What urged Terentia to write this letter was a memo she had received from Daniel Phillips, the then head of the Greek service. Phillips informed her that one of her colleagues would go over the broadcast scripts because her katharevousa, that is the purest form of modern Greek, was not, and I quote, 100% as required in the Greek section. In his memoirs, George Angeloglou, to whom we have referred earlier, brings up this issue and explains that one of the first things the members of the Greek section had to decide was what kind of language they were going to use. Yet Angeloglou asserts that contrary to the highly formal language and stylized diction of the Athens radio, the BBC Greek service rejected the language of the newspapers and adopted a simple news format instead. It is therefore possible that, as Terentia implies, a more conservative turn occurred in the mid or late 1940s during or after the Greek Civil War, which resulted in the news bulletins and press reviews being written in the purest or katharevousa form of modern Greek. Indeed, in the 1940s, the connection between Δημοτική, the Demotic or vernacular Greek, and communism was quite commonly made. When, for instance, in 1945, the Greek Minister of Education attempted to introduce Δημοτική as the official language, he was accused by the far right-wing press of promoting a communist agenda. As for the Greek state radio, it favored the use of katharevousa until as late as 1964, when its new director, appointed by the center-left government of Georgios Papandreou, introduced the use of Δημοτική in all of the station programs. And we'll pass over to Foteini now.
We're continuing with the literature here. This image depicts C.M. Forster delivering an interview to the Greek journalist of the BBC Sophroniou on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of C.P. Kavafi's birth. Forster, acclaimed novelist and critic, was one of the most prominent voices of English modernism. He was also a regular contributor to the BBC. In fact, for more than 30 years, he was the BBC's book reviewer. He reported on new books, and his recommendations, delivered in an accessible manner, catered to the non-specialist, reached huge audiences. Forster was also the person who first introduced Kavafi to the Anglophone world. He met the poet in Alexandria, and in 1919, he wrote a memorable critical essay about him, one which presented Kavafi, quote, at a slight angle to the universe, unquote, and systematically arranged for his poems to appear in English translation in the Criterion, the journal spearheaded by T.S. Eliot. In this way, Forster set the scene for Kavafi's posterity, and he was alive to witness the poet's swiftly accelerating fame, largely attributed to him, for the better part of the 20th century. This photograph therefore depicts an event of great significance taking place at the Greek section of the BBC. Firstly, the interview was taken in 1963, when a series of events commemorating Kavafi were broadcast across Greek media. By this time, Kavafi was enjoying immense popularity in Greece and elsewhere. And he was not popular just amongst literary circles. In Greece, he was also known to the wider Greek public, and his poems were regularly taught at schools. By inviting Forster to speak about Kavafi, the Greek section of the BBC was capitalizing upon the symbolic gravity that he had accrued, both as a famous British author and as an expert radio book critic for the BBC. Additionally, the interview was titled "The Poet C.P. Kavafi as I Knew Him." By closely engaging with Forster's personal memories of Kavafi, the interview was a token of intimacy. The Greek section of the BBC had secured an interview not just with any expert, but with the very person who had interacted with Kavafi and set the foundations for his global recognition. And as happens in such cases, when authors of the margins come to acquire worldwide status, the recognition extended beyond the poet himself to create additional visibility for literature written in Greek. This is therefore a prime moment of the BBC Greek Services operation as a platform bringing together the domestic and the international, a convergence point that was epitomized by the legendary meeting between Kavafi and Forster almost half a century earlier. Passing on now to Anna-Maria again.
Thanks, Foteini. The Greek service of the BBC fell silent on the 31st December 2005, after 66 years of continuous presence on the radio and later on the internet from 1939 to 2005. So together with the Greek service, 9 more departments closed, 7 of which are European. Since then, silence has marked also the discussions around the service, meaning that, except some memoirs from key agents, such as the one by Angelou, as well as other secondary literature sources, we have witnessed a limited interest and very few initiatives regarding the history of the Greek service of the BBC. A number of questions arise from this. How well do we know the history of the BBC Greek service, as well as the histories of its employees and programs? Where are the audio and written records, the legacy ones, of the Greek service in order to be studied and researched thoroughly? And also, to what extent has its function and contribution been assessed from a cultural, literary, and diplomatic history point of view? So what we know today regarding the Greek service is that its archive is largely uncharted, disparate, and this has not been systematically researched. Actually, there is not an archive of the Greek service as such, like the structure and documented collections and archives that the BBC as a corporation has developed. One might think that this happened because the Greek service and its agents haven't developed what is called an archive consciousness through the years by preserving and securing access to legacy recordings and documents. We do know that since 2005, a small part of the audio files of the Greek service is housed in the library of the Greek Parliament, actually, but without any provision for documentation and public access. However, we do not have any credible information on where the majority of the audio files, recordings, broadcastings, and many of the written documents, legacy and production ones, of the service are, thus lacking a more comprehensive understanding of the service. Indeed, this lack of archival curation towards the Greek services archive leads to a systematic lack of research interest and related initiatives regarding its contribution. For example, so far the history of the BBC Greek section has only been partially investigated as a tool of British foreign policy in the context of either the Second World War or the early Cold War period. However, the significance of the Greek section as a side of what we used to call as transcultural activity as part of the World Service, of the BBC World Service, and its role in, let's say, fostering Anglo-Greek relationships and its impact on Greek-speaking audiences worldwide, and all these areas and many more remain heavily undocumented. Another topic, which is still unexplored, is the involvement of key Greek modernist writers in the operation of the BBC Greek service. Indeed, during the first post-war decade, a number of cultural broadcasts were incorporated into the schedule and of the Greek service, and well-known Greek writers joined the BBC, such as Nanos Valauritis, for example, that I mentioned earlier, Zismos Lorejatos, Kambanis. The following years, leading figures of the 30s literary generation, such as George Seferis, Yorgos Seferis, and Odysseas Elitis, had sat before the microphone of the BBC, as we saw also. The relationship between the Greek modernism and radio has been entirely overlooked until recently, despite the fact that there is a growing interest among literary historians, primarily in the English-speaking world, for the relationship between the modernism and broadcasting, and also the fact that key modernist writers contributed to the broadcast output of both the Greek state radio, but also other Greek language services of international broadcasters, such as the Greek service of the BBC. So moving beyond existing approaches to Anglo-Greek intellectual history, as well as to Greek literary history of high modernism and avant-garde, which base their assumptions on the study of secondary print-based bibliography, it's crucial to bring into our research repertoire and agenda audio, and more specifically and more broadly, let's say, sound archival assets, and to enrich our historical readings also through the lens of Greek languages, broadcasting, and radio history. So the uncharted archive and history of the Greek service of the BBC, and more broadly of Greek radio history, can help us to contribute anew to chapters of diplomatic, literary, and cultural history of modern Greece. And it's about time to start exploring these archival traces of the Greek service of the BBC. Thank you.
Well, thank you, all three of you, Anna-Maria, Fiona, and Foteini, for this absolutely expert presentation and the absolutely startling archival material you brought up. I was just sitting here with my eyes wide open as to how much it covers, the sound archives, but then also even the discussion about the use of the language and how that relates back to older Greek politics while still being very much a matter of current Greek politics and self-representation of the Greeks. I very much liked also your passionate and expert call for the proper preservation and study of those archives. Not only is it overdue, but it seems obviously clear to all of us that you are the best qualified people to delve in, and that your expertise really beautifully complements one another to not only bring out the logistics, the archival component, the value of the sound archives, but also really paint for us that broader picture of transcultural and transnational relationships, diplomatic relationships, historical importance, important literary figures, modernism, revolutions. There's so much here pivoting around the Greek service in the BBC and the BBC. So I wish you every luck with your future endeavors, and I very much want to invite you to come back to the very location of Bush House, where we can host a longer format of this session in person with, I'm sure, lots of questions from an audience that is keenly interested and wants to know and learn a lot more. Thank you for giving us this absolutely compelling teaser of what promises to be very rich work as you progress and as you can come back to us to deliver later stages of the research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, and thank you all for listening.